Welcome to the Catholic Theology Show, sponsored in part by Annunciation Circle, a community that supports the mission of Ave Maria University through their monthly donations of $10 or more. If you'd like to support this podcast and the mission of Ave Maria, please visit avemaria.edu/donate for more information. I'm your host, Michael Dauphiné, and today I am very pleased to be joined with a returning guest, Dr. Julia Sadusky, who is an alum of Ave Maria, as well as a licensed and practiced clinical psychologist.
Hi,
So,
it's good to be with you all.
Glad to have you on the show. And Julia, would you just tell us a little bit about some of the work you're currently doing?
Sure, yeah. So as you mentioned, I'm a licensed psychologist in Colorado. So I have a private practice there, and a lot of what I do is see clients every week, so about 20 hours of therapy a week with people, walking with them through a lot of different things. My specialty is sexuality and gender and the intersection of those with faith. And then I work with people with eating disorders, grief and loss, and trauma histories, so a lot related to that. And then I do some writing and speaking around topics related to sexuality as well.
That's great. And we've had two earlier episodes, one on really sex, kind of the Catholic understanding of sexuality and gender in kind of dialogue with or response to often very confused understandings within our culture. And then also just the general question about psychology and kind of Catholicism and how an authentic psychological healing can really complement a spiritual renewal.
That's right. Both really fun conversations for
me.
So
it's great to have you on the show. And I think you also have some books, how to talk to your children, how do you talk to your kids about sex, and how to talk to your teens about sex, and one or two other books on sexuality and gender. So thanks so much for all you're doing.
Thank you.
I think you're at Ave because you're going to be getting an award. Is that true?
That's what I'm told, yes.
Yeah. So you're going to be inducted into the Ave Alum Hall of Fame?
Well, so there's a kind of award, the John Paul II Award that they're giving me, and so I'm excited to.
That's right. I think the Hall of Fame one is for the student athletes.
The student athletes.
That's right. You were a good tennis player.
That's right.
But you're being awarded actually for what you went professional in, which was not tennis,
That's
right? But it was
if only.
It was for this wonderful work you're doing in psychology. So we thought today, it sounds very strange, right? But I love the topic of grief. Grief and maybe even a little bit of trauma, right? That we might talk about. And I think this is so close to so many people's experience at some point.
Right.
So many people, I've just, heard a story recently of someone who basically, walked out of church in their 20s because their brother had died. And, never walked back.
Right.
That was such a profound loss. And yet at the same time, right, ultimately nothing is more consoling than the promise that Christ offers us.
Right.
But yet, right, grief is not, it's not an intellectual thing. Right. So it's an intellectual thing. It's a psychological thing. It's even a bodily thing that just somehow disfigures us in such a way that, the healing is just complex. It doesn't heal in the way it doesn't heal like a broken bone.
Right.
A broken bone when it heals, you're as good as new. They sometimes say broken bones are stronger, right? It's more like sometimes people describe, the loss of a loved one as closer to an amputation, right? The wound heals, but you don't ever have a part of yourself again. So how do you begin helping people understand grief, work through grief?
It's a great question. I think most people listening know this experience to some extent, even if they haven't lost a loved one. Life is full of loss. It's full of change and little deaths, right? And so I think the first thing in psychology that we try to do is name grief. it's always striking to me with people, just saying the word out loud when I can say you're grieving a huge loss. Things aren't how they're supposed to be, and honoring the kind of injustice within a loss, within a death, whether it's physical or relational. You can see it in people that something clicks in them that starts to really honor the magnitude of the pain. And I often say that, as you mentioned, grief is not the kind of thing that you do for a time and then you can check that off your list and keep going. I think of grief as something that's kind of like a school where you're being formed in the way to move through this experience of loss over and over and over again. And so you can get effective in it, in a sense. But the magnitude, the intensity of it doesn't really change.
Yeah. Now, there's C.S. Lewis writes a book called A Grief Observed. It's a book that a lot of people really have enjoyed or found helpful. He kind of just tries, I think he does an excellent job of just capturing the raw feelings of grief. He kind of wrote it as a journal. And so it has kind of an expression, I think, that helps people feel, oh, I'm not alone in feeling this way. Even a great Christian, right, author, great Christian man can feel awful. And he has this one description I wanted to read, though. Right, he says this: "No one told me that grief is also like fear. I am not afraid, but the sensation is like being afraid. The same fluttering in the stomach, the same restlessness, the yawning. I keep on swallowing. At other times, I feel like being mildly drunk or concussed. There's a sort of invisible blanket between the world and me. I find it hard to take in what anyone says, or perhaps hard to want to take it in. It is so uninteresting. Yet I want the others to be about me. I dread the moments when the house is empty. If only they would talk to one another and not to me." What does this maybe capture a little bit about just the phenomenon of grief?
Yeah. You see right off the bat the complexity of grief, right? That grief is something that accounts for a lot of different things. He talks about fear. He talks about isolation. He talks about wanting to be connected and also wanting to be far away. And then he talks about what happens when you are in a house alone, right? That you want to be with people, and then when you're with people, but please don't talk to me, right? And so just the complexity of that. And I think he does such a great job of using analogy, because grief sounds so clean cut. It's such a short word. And it's so many things, conflicting things at the exact same time. And so I think he really gets it right when he accounts for that. And something that you really can't do justice to, or you can't even know what it feels like until you're in it to some extent. It's a bit too abstract, but once you're there, you know it on the inside. I often tell people that when you have one loss, and I've had several major losses in my life, and when I have one, it touches on all the rest. And so that just brings up a lot as far as the layers to grief as well.
Yeah, it is interesting. Every time I'm at a funeral or a wake, which I was recently, all of the wakes I've been to just physically come to mind, and I will also say sometimes, and the wakes I will go to, that there's something about it that, because it's not, I don't know, it's a core memory. I don't know what you might put it, but it's a core memory that somehow is never fully resolved.
Right.
And so, how then, if somebody, comes to you with or maybe even, obviously if somebody comes to you, but I think also sometimes when or like somebody who, when you know another person who just goes through a huge loss, when like, I mean, do you, like, how do you suggest people begin the grieving process? How would you suggest, what kind of help might people consider getting?
Yeah, that early phase is such a fog. It's such a blur, and it's as if your body votes and your body's going to grieve with or without your permission. I think I hear often, people will wake up in the night and it's as if you get hit again with the reality of what you might have forgotten. Like, I wake up and I remember they're gone. And so the body just responds to that, and we can do a lot to fight that. And so a lot of that early phase is really just allowing my body to respond in the way that it's going to the reality of heartbreaking loss. So letting yourself cry as much or as little as your body will let you, because sometimes we think of grief as intense emotion, and a lot of times it's also numbness. It's a total system shutdown when it's just too big, right? And that can feel really out of control. And I think so many people also judge their grief. They feel like they're doing it wrong. So if I don't cry, what does that mean? If I cry and can't catch my breath, what does that mean? If I'm angry and irritable, if I'm nauseous and I feel unable to, nourish my body, what does that mean? And just remembering that grief is so many things, and the only way to do it right is to pay attention and ride the wave of it as long as it takes you. I think for people who want help with grief, I do think, again, that idea of connecting to people that C.S. Lewis talks about who know what it's like on the inside, because then we don't have to use that many words. But having people who say, I'm here, having people who ask what's coming up for you today. I think a lot of people, especially in Western culture, we don't want to ask people about their grief because we don't want to intrude or we don't want to cause them pain. I know in my own life and with clients and friends, everybody says the same thing. I'm thinking about this grief, or I'm thinking about this person, whether you bring them up or not.
Yes.
And all it does when you bring it up is it gives me permission to bring that to you. And so just remembering that people are feeling and moving through grief in so many different ways and every single day. And it's such a gift when we enter into that, even if we have no idea what to say. And if we don't know what to say, the best thing to say is, I don't know what to say.
That's very well put. Very well put. So there's a, like, I don't know, it's hard to know sometimes the way of putting the words, but there's a particular grief associated with death, right? A particular grief associated with death, a kind of finality, God willing, penultimate, not an ultimate finality, right? God willing, a penultimate reality in which we will eventually have a reunion according to God's mercy and providence, in his hands, etc. We don't know exactly who or what, but there is hope, and yet at the same time, there's also kind of like an element of grief that can happen when relationships maybe no longer function as well. We were talking a little bit before, you called them ambiguous relationships. There's a book actually that I have called Opening Our Hearts, Transforming Our Losses. It's published by Al-Anon, which is a 12-step program for basically family members who are bothered by other people's drinking or using. But it just says this: we all have dreams, hopes, plans for the future. One of the devastating effects of living with alcoholism or addiction is that our dreams for the future, for the lives we thought we would have, go unfulfilled. We may have been looking forward to a long, happy life with our spouse or partner, only to have that dream shattered. A happy family life eluded us, or our children may have grown up amid chaos and even violence. Unresolved anger, grudges, memories of abuse can divide our families and our friendships. Alcoholism or addiction can rob us of our dreams, and the magnitude of those losses can affect every aspect of our lives. Right? And so this is where it says the losses that come, right, often occur gradually and may differ from other experiences of grief. And yet, right, this idea that, these losses of maybe the relationships that we anticipated we would have with our siblings, with adult children, with parents, different things like this can be devastating and fill us with grief. How do we talk about those forms of grief as grief while validating that, while still validating the ultimate character of death? So I don't know if that's a question that comes up a lot, but it seems like one that comes up in my mind, in my experience. I wanted just to ask you to help us walk through that, kind of these different layers of grief within our experience.
Yeah, most people don't think of what you just shared in their own experience as grief. They wouldn't label it that way. They might say, I'm in pain. They might say, I'm upset about this thing, or I wish it was different, or I just need to accept this, or I just need to pray more about this relationship and accept God's will. But we don't often categorize those appropriately as grief. And it is a grief. It is a huge loss, a loss of relationship. And in psychology, we call that ambiguous loss, meaning that there's not an anniversary as such. I can't point to on this day at this time, this thing happened and they died. And then we had a funeral and there was a collective appreciation for the significance of this moment. And as you know, right, that makes it so much harder to honor it. And so when you lose the relationship you hope to have with a family member, or when a job doesn't turn out the way you hoped, or even when you experience kind of being robbed of something that you were due in childhood, if you experienced trauma, for instance, I can't get that back. And my body carries the memory of what ought to have been there as much as we carry memories of what was there. And so these ambiguous losses, I think, end up being a lot harder to validate. And much in the same way as kind of griefs that come from actual death, the world keeps turning. And people often forget, but you can't forget. And you have these ongoing experiences. Let's say you're estranged from a parent, and then you have a kind of significant event, and they're not going to be there. And it can be such a celebratory time, a graduation or something like that. For many people, aren't you so excited? But internally, there's grief. And that can be really difficult to appreciate, to honor, and to share about, because it feels like we ought to feel happy, pure and simple. But these ambiguous losses move through us and with us, just like a death does. They just simply are often a lot harder to talk about.
It also seems to me that within that is maybe a whole category of like breakups, divorces,
yes,
that are that's something I have not directly experienced, but I it's clear even just in our pop songs, if you want to have a pop, we don't agree about much, but we all kind of agree that breakups are bad.
Yes,
and so you can always write a
right.
song
That's right.
about a breakup, and
Yes.
but yet I think there's something about the human heart that's made for communion, and we don't quite get it. And sometimes that communion that we want isn't just imperfect; it's kind of gets shattered. So, what are different things maybe for this relational dimension? Either maybe that, somebody who loses a spouse through death, or, and maybe what are some unique things about that, or somebody who, loses a spouse or a significant relationship through a breakup.
Yeah, I would say with the spouse being lost to death, right? Again, what would be similar between that and losing somebody to a breakup is both have hopes, as you read, right? Both have anticipated future opportunities for communion that are now gone. The challenge with these ambiguous losses, though, so a breakup or a divorce, is that person still exists, but they don't exist to you. in the way they did before, right? It's like they're still here. I could call them on the phone, but it'll never be the same. And that is really hard to navigate and to process and to make sense of. And I think of both griefs, the grief of a death and the grief of something like a breakup, as if our body is kind of revolting to the not okayness of something, right? Like it's not supposed to be this way. And that is a really important thing to honor and expect, because there is a kind of response to the injustice of living in a fallen world in that.
Yeah. I experienced, I think when I was about 10, I had a cousin who was 2 years old, died suddenly in a car accident. And when I was 13, I had a sister who died in a sudden plane crash. And I think, the death, the not okayness, the radical awfulness of a world in which these things happen, was kind of just so palpable. This intense and for me at the time, it was a very strong rejection of any Christian faith. Ironically, it was my sister who had kind of, in the recent couple of years, had kind of found a deep conversion to Jesus Christ and had developed a real relationship with him and had reintroduced me as a baptized Catholic. But this element of, so anyway, so that was like, so when I kind of came back to the faith, I was so excited when I began to read what Scripture actually taught about death.
Yes.
And there are two things that always struck me. One, which I just remember a friend of mine at the time who was a Christian. I was 13. I was kind of very immature and angry and all this sort of weird stuff. But I do remember I had one, and also at the same time thought I knew everything, unfortunately, which is kind of embarrassing to say, but
as we do at that age.
But
yes.
True. But this person wrote Revelation 21:4. And so I looked it up. And he will wipe away every tear from their eyes. Death shall be no more, neither shall there be mourning, nor crying, nor pain anymore, for the former things have passed away. Behold, I make all things new. And at that time, it did not comfort me or console me, but it's interesting. I remembered it. And so I sometimes also kind of remind people, you don't necessarily have to say the right thing, but just, like say what's on your heart.
Right.
Like if, that's one thing. But it's interesting. So God will create a world where death will be no more. But then I read in Wisdom, the book of Wisdom in the Old Testament, Wisdom 2, where it says that, right, God created man for immortality. He created us, but it was through the devil's envy that death entered the world. And that was just like I was like, oh, that's why I hate death so much.
Yes.
Death's not supposed to be here.
Right.
Death is not part of God's plan. God's plan is that we would live with him forever. And that's where we started, and that's where we will end up. But death entered the world through the envy of the devil, and also right through our own envious selves and sin and destruction. And so there's a kind of deep harmony between this sense that Christians ought not like death. Like there's some ways of thinking about the world, some religious traditions, or kind of there's a lot of beauty in Stoicism, but Stoicism tends to think kind of like death is natural or something like that. And I kind of love the fact that Christianity says we should accept death because death, we have to accept death. Let's put it this way. So let's not curse the world and God because of it, because God is our only hope. So but if you could just say a little bit about this understanding, kind of from maybe a theological or Catholic perspective, where we kind of, it's something like in my mind, it's like we intuitively know that death's not okay.
Right.
Which I think ends up being this sort of sense that there's something in us that remembers and looks forward to this world for which we were actually created, which is to be in harmony with God and with one another in a kind of stable relationship of life.
Right. Yeah, I love that line of, we're made for immortality. And we bear that in our bodies, right? We carry that in our bodies, that deep knowing that this is not all it is. This is not how it's supposed to be. And so people can think about when there is a death or an ambiguous loss, right? What happens? Well, we struggle to eat a lot of times. We kind of lose that instinct to eat. We struggle to sleep. We struggle to kind of focus and pay attention because, again, our whole body is revolting. It's saying this is not okay. And what I love about Christ and what he did for us is he said, it's not okay with me either, right? And
Yes.
he cared so much about it that he kind of moved with compassion, right? In the agony in the garden, he was sorrowful even unto death. And I often think of Lazarus, right? Like Christ knew. He knew he was going to raise him. And he wept. But we don't often think about the fact that Lazarus died again, right? At some point, Lazarus died. He's not currently walking the earth. And that points to the reality of death that we have to, as you said, contend with. We will die. Death is the door to eternal life for those of us who have life in Christ, right? And death is painful, excruciating, not what God wants for us ultimately. But God was not silent in death. God entered, right, and took on all of it for our sake. And so he put skin in the game, I guess, is what's worth remembering. And it doesn't mean we don't get mad and we're not allowed to be incredulous and angry and indignant and scared and overwhelmed by death. In fact, I think it justifies that we can feel and will inevitably, if we allow ourselves, feel all of those kind of revolting emotions to the not okayness of this. And yes, remembering that we follow a God who will wipe away every tear from our eyes and will restore every single thing that's been lost. And that's a supernatural gift of hope, right? To encounter that. And I don't know that we fully can grasp that until we're there.
Yeah. We're going to take a break in a minute. And when we get back, I want to kind of unpack a little bit about how do we kind of draw from the faith in our healing of grief and at the same time avoid a kind of a very simplistic idea that the faith ought to just remove grief, right? So when we come back in a moment, I'd love to dive into that with you.
That sounds great.
You're listening to the Catholic Theology Show, presented by Ave Maria University and sponsored in part by Annunciation Circle. Through their generous donations of $10 or more per month, Annunciation Circle members directly support the mission of AMU to be a fountainhead of renewal for the Church through our faculty, staff, students, and alumni. To learn more, visit avemaria.edu/join. Thank you for your continued support, and now let's get back to the show.
So we've been speaking about grief, what it is, how we understand it, how it is something that operates in our bodies, in our emotions, as well as in our minds and our wills. And kind of trying to figure out how do we recover this kind of robust sense that the gospel helps, right? That the gospel's good news of Jesus's conquering death. And this actually gives us consolation. And yet at the same time, right, it does not take away, right, the loss and suffering and the perhaps the inability to fully recover, right? That the recovery is possible and yet also not complete in this life. There's a beautiful line that I remember reading about early on in my conversion from 1 Thessalonians 4:13, where Paul says, "Brethren," right, "we would not have you ignorant concerning those who are asleep." Right? Death, that's what he means by this, right? "That you may not grieve as others do who have no hope." And it's the importance of that as. We don't grieve as those who have no hope, but we grieve as those who have hope. Right? And there's a quote that I had read in Magnificat that I felt really spoke to this. It was by the servant of God, Elizabeth Lesueur. She was a 19th century French woman who had an atheist husband. And after she died, he read her journal and was so overwhelmed by it that he converted. I don't know if he became a priest or a monk or something or not, but I think he ended up getting her journal published. And it was I don't remember who has it published now, but maybe Magnificat or something. But this is what she writes, and she had gone through a lot of suffering. But this is what she writes. Even if my grief is inconsolable and has totally changed my life. And I love this, right? Inconsolable and has totally changed my life. I must not give in to depression and sadness. Since I'm not entirely able to lead the life I would like, it is all the more necessary to make my actual life more fruitful for God and for those entrusted to me. So just kind of walk us through a little bit about how do we recover this sense of mission, meaning, and purpose through our divine calling, while also having that sense, right? So therefore not giving into depression or sadness, but living lives of fruitfulness. And yet at the same time, admitting that maybe my grief is inconsolable and has totally changed my life, as Elizabeth Lesueur writes.
Yeah, it's so hard, right? Because I think a lot of people, when they hear Thessalonians, they want to say there, I want to not grieve because I have hope. And, the spirit of the quote you just shared is, can I just be consolable though? And then my life will bear fruit, right? But she speaks to the pervasiveness of grief, that I will carry it with me. And sometimes I talk with clients about it's always going to be there. So where do you want to go?
Wow, it is going to be there. So we can't outrun it.
No.
Or we can't hide from it.
No, and it will change your life. It will continue, and you will never exhaust, I think, an awareness of the many ways that it changes you and it changes your life. And the way I talk about that is wisdom. There's actually wisdom in grief that you don't get anywhere else. I remember when my dad passed away, one of my friends couldn't come to the funeral for a really valid reason. And when her mom passed away years later, she called me on the phone and she said, I didn't realize what it was like. And I wish I had been there. Because she now got the magnitude of it. And what a beautiful gift, right?
Yeah.
For her to be able to not just show up for me in that all those years later when I was still grieving, by the way.
Yeah.
Right? But then for me to show up in it with her and do what was helpful for me in that moment. And I see it now as a therapist with clients where I'm simultaneously not grateful for the things that I've survived and the things I've witnessed. And I'm really grateful because I get to be a different person in the world. My life bears fruit differently. And I think that's the redemptive story, right? Happening in our midst, happening in our lives. And one of my clients shared with me the image of a garden as kind of this idea of life in grief, that you plant more around it, but that area is always going to be tilled over and over again. But life kind of expands around it if you let it. And it, unfortunately, or fortunately, the only way to bear fruit, I think, is when even things inside of us die. And I think moving through the grieving process is letting ourselves in some ways give in to depression so that depression is not where we stay.
Yeah, that's beautifully put. I remember picking up a book, I think it's by like Marianne Budnick or something. It was called like, Why Does God Let People Suffer? I don't remember, something like this. It was like a short book. It was on a retreat. But all I remember is picking it up, and the opening line of it, the opening like little paragraph was just that, like, before we try to figure this out, let's just make an observation. But she just says, like, if you were going through something, would you want to talk with somebody who had never suffered, or would you want to talk with somebody who'd suffered? And she says, somebody who's never suffered may be a decent person, right? But they're going to lack a kind of depth. I don't want to say necessarily. I think she might have said they're shallow. I'm not sure I would say that. But you know, that in a way, you're going to gravitate to those who have suffered. So it doesn't make sense if we're comparing it to this fictional world, a world without suffering, which I think, unfortunately, is like one of our haunting myths of modernity, is that we somehow could have a world without suffering, and therefore we're mad that we're in a world with suffering, instead of just recognizing we're in a world with suffering. Like it's ubiquitous, right? It's ubiquitous. It's all over the place. And the beautiful thing is that God enters into our suffering, and he offers us a way through it, right? Trusting him. Benedict XVI would say that in his encyclical Spe Salvi, but he says that the early Christians thought of Christ as with the images of the philosopher and as the shepherd. And he said that the philosopher in the ancient times was meant to prepare for death. That was Socrates' definition of philosophy, a preparation for death, gaining wisdom, and to lose the fear of death. And then the shepherd is, well, shepherd. And so he said that Jesus is, of course, the true philosopher because he's the true shepherd. He shepherds us through death, right? And he quotes Psalm 23, right? Even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I fear no evil, for you are with me. Your rod and your staff, they comfort me. Well, Jesus is with us. Like, if you were going to die, you'd want to die. I mean, if you do something really awful, it'd be nice to do it with somebody who'd done it before.
That's right.
But one of the problems is we can't ever die with anyone else, right? But we actually do get to die with one person. Jesus can take our hand and look into our eyes and say, don't worry, I've done this before, right? You know, I've died and I've risen. Right. And so now we never die alone. Right. There's an existential loneliness in our death. Yes. But we can find meaning and peace. And anyway, I've always found that very hopeful. It's hard in the moments of grief or loss sometimes to remember that. And yet it's often, I think, those elements of suffering that actually also make us most aware of our communion with other people. I think like grief is either that which kind of most isolates us, and when we go through it, it can also be that which, you know, you can hold another person's hand or receive a hug from another person, and at that moment you kind of feel connected with them in a way that is a real gift and kind of rare to see in most of our lives.
That's right. That's right. There's a story that really strikes me about kind of what you're getting at both the companionship, the accompaniment of God, but also the kind of trudging through it, right? That can be really alienating. There was a kind of loss that I experienced where I was telling somebody that I needed more light from God. I couldn't see ahead and how we're going to do this, right? I don't know how to do this. I don't know how to grieve. And this friend of mine said, I have this image of you being in a dark room with somebody next to you with a light. And you're only going to be able to see one step in front of you to put one foot in front of the other. And my response in my grief was, I need more light. But she said, no, you're going to have just enough light to see one foot in front of the other. And I think Christ as shepherd does that for us. He's kind of right next to us, and he's guiding us just a little bit at a time. But there is enough light to see just what we need to see at each step of the way. Yeah.
Saint Therese of Lisieux wrote, I only suffer for one moment. It is because people think about the past and the future that they become discouraged and despair. She, of course, as we know, went through a fair amount of discouragement and despair, but she didn't remain in it. She was somehow able to keep turning her life over to God because of a certain sense of just suffering for a moment. So kind of part of the reason I need to somewhat like glance at the past like a mirror in my rearview mirror, but don't rest in the suffering of the past and don't rest in the fear of the suffering of the future. But if I just, maybe the reason why I can only see a little bit is because that's all I'm supposed to see. Right. And then it becomes manageable. Just the moment right now is all I can kind of enter into.
And I think, counterintuitively, maybe people are afraid of letting themselves feel grief because they're afraid it will lead to despair, or I'll kind of never come out of it. And the good news about our bodies and our psyches is that we can only feel an emotion for about 3 minutes if we give ourselves completely to it. And so for people to remember that, if you lean in and allow yourself to feel the despair that's there, it will actually subside much more quickly than if we run from it.
Yes. Yeah. If it's lasting longer, it's because our minds are recurring, are bringing it back.
That's right.
And this is, Jesus himself said, do not be anxious about tomorrow, for tomorrow will be anxious for itself. Right? As another verse has it, right? Tomorrow has enough suffering of its own, right? But don't only worry about the suffering of today. This sometimes when people talk about grief, I think it's natural to speak a little bit about trauma, and trauma can elevate or certain aspects of grief and loss and sorrow. And, so could you just say a little bit about what is trauma? I think it's something that's kind of really entered our large vocabulary, but I think sometimes it's kind of vague about what it is, and maybe how we experience it, and how we also maybe can learn to somehow, right? I don't know. I don't say get through it. Doesn't seem like the right word, but somehow keep living.
Yes.
And somehow, again, recognize it, validate these things, and yet still grow and still live.
Right.
We validate our grief, but we don't embalm it. We somehow have to keep that garden alive and keep growing. So tell us a little bit about trauma in your work.
Yeah, so the best definition I find for trauma is things that exceed our capacity to cope, that they kind of take us beyond what we can manage and tolerate, and maybe in many cases beyond what we're made for, what we're made to tolerate as people. And so that can span a lot of different things, right? Things that we're not meant for, we're not meant to experience, but we find ourselves having to navigate because of evil and sin and brokenness in the world. But trauma can take many forms, right? Kind of surviving a near-death experience can be a trauma. Being in an active combat zone, certainly major losses can be traumatic. Relational losses, so estrangement can be a trauma. And even experiences of neglect. We don't always think of experiences of neglect as trauma, but these situations where we didn't have the thing we needed, and that meant we couldn't manage the situation effectively. And so, for people who are navigating trauma and I think trying to figure out, how do I weather a world when I've experienced things that have really gone outside of what I can navigate on my own and have continued to hurt me and show up for me and push me around even now. Actually, the key is, number one, reestablishing safety, kind of reestablishing a sense of anchor in the world again. Part of that means honoring the reality of what was there. We have to kind of name something for what it was. Usually what we try to do is we try to blame ourselves for it. We try to say, oh, I must have done something, or we kind of rage at everybody in the world for it, that it's everybody else's kind of responsibility, and that can move us to a place of despair. But really accurately accounting for what was and what wasn't right there. So maybe my parent was supposed to protect me, and they didn't. And I suffered, and it wasn't my fault, actually, but it was out of my control. I couldn't have handled it differently than I did. And that's really painful, right? And then the other piece that I think we often forget about is we think of healing from trauma as getting better at handling negative emotions. Oftentimes, like, you're just supposed to be able to handle your anger better or your sadness better. But I find that most of trauma healing is actually being able to tolerate positive emotions again, being able to enter into a world where I can feel alive, where I can play, where I can kind of have fun and enjoy things without constantly feeling guilty or ashamed or being brought back to these places of real agony again.
Well, so somehow this experiencing suffering and evil in some way that exceeds our capacity to cope then it kind of is like where our psyches, or our kind of our thoughts, our emotions, and our brain is our reason is somehow trying to make sense of it.
Correct.
But it can't make sense of it, so
Correct.
it just keeps bringing it back, and then that blocks re-engagement with the positive and joys and connections. Is that kind of
That's exactly right. That's exactly it. Yes, it really can impede our ability to re-engage in a world that we somehow now know is not fully safe, is not fully predictable. And so it's so validating, I think, for people when we can just say, I don't get it either. These situations that happen don't make sense. They're not computable.
Yeah.
How is it that a parent hurts a child? How is it that an adult, attacks a vulnerable person? I mean, how is it that there's active war and violence of such a magnitude that so many people are hurt? It's not computable. And instead of trying to tell a story that hangs together but isn't accurate, it's better to kind of acknowledge the reality of the not okayness of these types of things.
Yeah, that reminds me a little bit of Job, where, and Aquinas is clear that Job, even though he somewhat kind of expresses his intense dissatisfaction with God and everything, I wish that I had not been born, right? He also, though, he says he never, it's like what he says is he never, though, he's still blessed Job. He's Saint Job, because Job never stopped believing and trusting in God with his logos, with his mind, with his reason, even though at the level of his emotions, he was basically cursing the day of his birth. And so the fact that these two, that we can have these intense emotional disturbances while still having faith, I just think it's a beautiful thing. But at the end of that, I think it's really powerful. He asks like kind of why and all these different things, and everybody gives him lots of reasons, and all the reasons that everybody offers him end up being false. People are trying to make sense out of it, but you can't make sense out of it. And so God finally says, basically, it's not, the question that we should ask is not why. Why did this happen? Why is this happening? Why does God allow this? The real question is who? Who can save us from this?
Wow. Yes, and that's helpful, right? Because it implies relationship with somebody who will never do what was done, and somebody who can provide the security, the stability, that in the absence of we experience trauma.
Yeah. So maybe, if somebody's listening to this and, has a friend, a family member, perhaps themselves sees aspects of unresolved grief, unresolved trauma, numbnesses, difficulty engaging in the present moment with other people. What are some kind of, other than flying out to Colorado and having you as a, therapist, what are some maybe just practical tips or skills that people can practice, or activities? What might you suggest?
Yeah. So I think the first thing, even before I move to just the practical pieces, although it's quite practical, it doesn't feel that way, is people remembering what compassion means and making a practice of compassion towards themselves and their pain. So grief is hard enough. Loss is hard enough. Trauma is hard enough. Judging your loss, judging your trauma, judging your grief, blaming yourself for it is harder. And so bringing compassion, which is to suffer with, right, to that moment, and inviting the you who is wounded, right, to tell you all about it. What this does is it gives us a little bit of space, right, where I can kind of receive what's happening, but it's not happening in me as much. I'm hearing it, I'm receiving it, right? And so I might ask the part of me that's grieving, what do you want me to know about what's going on right now? And then drawing kind of this care, like, I care about you. I hate that you're suffering. I don't want that for you, which ultimately is what Christ does with us. Beyond that, on a very practical domain, the idea I mentioned earlier is reestablishing safety, right? How do we reestablish safety after loss, after trauma? Predictability is really key. I mean, there's all kinds of compulsive things we develop to cope, right? Because we benefit from order, we benefit from routine. So establishing a rhythm and a routine again, as hard as it is, to orient your life around is key, whether that's spiritual practices or whether that's, simply getting up and going for a walk for 5 minutes. But doing something that anchors you in your body is really key. And then grounding in your environment, when people start to let their mind wander and they find themselves caught in a memory or they feel like they're back there in that situation again, just taking a minute, stopping, taking a few deep breaths and looking around and reminding yourself, where am I and who am I with? And being able to re-engage your brain on a very neurological level in the present moment is very anchoring, and it doesn't take the pain away. I often joke that, there are substances that will try to do that with many consequences, but we can't just take it away through grounding. It will be there. So what happens is we expand around it, we contain it. And then the last thing I would say is relational, right? It's how do we invite even one person into being with us in our suffering? Because it's hard when we're in it to offer that compassion to ourselves. And most of us, if we're honest, we don't have many people who can show up in these things with us and for us. But whether that's Christ in prayer, whether that's the Blessed Mother, or whether that's one person in your life, and you can say what C.S. Lewis says, I want you to be with me, but don't talk to me. and just being honest about what's one thing we need in that moment, even if it's I need somebody to come over and sit with me as I fold my laundry because I haven't done that in a few weeks. These are the things practically that make a difference when it comes to reestablishing safety, connecting again to ourselves and others. And maybe as I'm folding laundry, we actually have a good time together and can laugh for the first time in a few days.
That's really encouraging. I love the, it's really kind of recovering somehow like the beginning of wonder at, there's that focus of the sense of frustration, anger, loss, sadness. It's all real, right? But somehow it's not the whole picture, right? And I think you're right. When we become aware of ourselves doing that, and we can become we can share that with again, it has to be the right person, right? But then we can begin to kind of, and sometimes that can be finding, 12-step groups, grief recovery groups, trauma loss groups or different things like that I think are structured. I have a good friend who's starting actually a divorced, it's like for Catholics, because it's kind of like you have particular issues within the Catholic tradition, because marriage is also, indissoluble, which is, complex, right? And yet still people suffer in this way. So finding, I think, other, that can be a key element. But also there's something as simple. Yeah, I've heard it said sometimes, like notice, what is it, like four colors,
that's right.
3 sounds, 2 things you're touching, and then what's the one next thing you need to do? And you just kind of begin to, and you realize, oh, that's what Jesus was saying.
Yes.
Right? It's kind of like, that's what Jesus was saying, is put yourself in the present moment. And, are there, do you find that, this certain sense of like re-engaging in life? You'd mentioned going for walks, folding laundry, getting a routine. What are other things that you find are kind of common things that often, that people might maybe overlook? They're kind of thinking like, oh, they should pray the Psalms, which they, sure. I think they're great. I love them. I'm a big fan. But and for some people that's really beautiful, and the Psalms actually weep a ton, which is beautiful, but still in hope. But for like, I don't know how to put, just like, are there other things somewhere between folding laundry and praying? And hopefully we do both, right? But are there other things that you find helpful?
Yeah, I think solitude ends up being a surprisingly helpful one for people. Now, solitude is different from loneliness, right? You can be alone and not be lonely. So putting yourself in situations where you kind of bring the intensity down. Sometimes with clients, just being able to dim the lights in the room, it brings down the sensitivity and the sensory overload that life can be after loss. And we don't often think about this, but I've had people share that if you're walking down the street and people are smiling in the midst of intense grief, you can almost feel accosted by their very presence. Like, what are you so happy about? And so just turning down the kind of intensity of outside stimuli, quiet, can be really, really helpful. Instead of kind of feeling like I feel this pressure to just move through and bounce around. If you notice yourself bouncing like a ping pong ball off the wall, just slowing your movements in a way that, again, brings you right back to the present moment. These are things that end up being really, really helpful. And then, I hate to say this, but it's true, actually feeling it. So much of healing is feeling safely. Can I put myself in a position where I'm sitting outside on a bench and I'm in a place where no one can see me, and I just let myself feel whatever's there, whether, again, it's nothingness or it's overwhelm or it's anger or whatever's there. And then if you have an image of a person or God or even yourself, an older version of you who can sit with that person and imagine that face of care and love and kindness as you feel, we can tend to feel a lot less alone. For people listening, there are actual organizations. You mentioned grief groups. Grief Share is a great place to go where you can have this embodied experience of just, I'm not alone in this. Wings Foundation is an excellent trauma resource that does many incredible groups to help people move through stages of healing. And if there was kind of a to-do list that meant we didn't have to feel it, I think we would have found it by now.
Yeah.
But finding ways to, awaken your ability to be where your feet are. And trust that your body can handle where you are, even though it doesn't feel that way.
There are two quotes that come to mind that maybe as we're finishing our time together. One is from Job, which is, I know that my Redeemer lives. And just amidst it all, I know that my Redeemer lives, and that's helpful. That I can make a decision to turn my life, my will over to him. Because I know that I can't manage life on my own. So I love that sense. I know that my Redeemer lives. And the other thing is, one of the earlier podcast guest was Immaculée Alibageza, who is the survivor of the Rwandan genocide in 1994. And she was actually sitting right here in this studio and gave a beautiful, anyway, if you know the story, if you don't listen to the episode. But she said after she actually got out and she just was breaking down weeping when she saw that her home was destroyed, burned, and several of the family members had been slaughtered. She just heard God saying to her something like, they're home. You're not. You still have to journey home. And then she said, life is short, eternity is long. Life is short, eternity is long. And that basically got her through. And the grace of the Holy Spirit and just her tremendous spirit. But I love it. Life is short, eternity is long. We will be home soon, sooner than we can imagine.
That's right.
And so it may seem interminable, but life's not.
Yeah, I love that. It's so important to find ways to anchor in the reality that is not accounted for in our present encounter with reality.
Yeah.
Right? To encounter the truth of what's really real, which is eternal life.
Yeah.
And speaking in a way that brings that to life. I actually had somebody recently share with me that they've been in a season of just intense suffering and grief and loss. And somebody said to them, I had this dream that you were in heaven at the end of your life. And in the dream, you were talking to somebody and they said to you, you suffered a lot in life. And he responded back, suffering. I remember the word, but I don't remember what it feels like.
Wow.
And
Mm-hmm.
so I know that my Redeemer lives. These ideas that, the fleeting and the intense magnitude of these experiences of pain on this side of things, God understands why we get so bogged down. And in a broader perspective, we can hold on to the reality that's not able to be encountered fully here.
That's great. And for those who are interested in learning more about your work, how can they find you?
Yeah, so the best way to follow my work is through my website, juliasadusky.com, and people can see my resources. They can see upcoming events. I have an Instagram page. That's where I usually post travel and those kinds of things. But a lot of, exciting new resources. I'm trying to get out into the church every so often. So those are probably the best ways to follow my work.
And is 988, is that still the national suicide hotline?
Yes.
So if you, are listening to the show or know someone who's in intense grief or trauma and, having that sense of like, do I want to continue to live or in that area of just intense distress, that is always a number that you can call. And I believe always gets you in touch with a local, it's a national hotline, but it actually gets you in touch with local services, which one of which is the David Lawrence Center, where my wife works as a counselor and as now the chief operating officer. And I believe you worked there for a year, right? After graduation, before going back to school.
That was my first job, yes, before I went back to school for my doctorate and changed my life. Yes, being able to walk with people in that space was incredible.
That's great. Well, thank you so much for being on the show today.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed today's episode, please hit the like button and subscribe to the Catholic Theology Show. Thanks, and God bless.